What if the healthy fat you drizzled tonight quietly sets your arteries on a course they can't easily reverse? Food labels whisper reassurance while chemistry tells a different, harder truth. For a muscle that beats about 100,000 times a day, the wrong oils can pile on the work one meal at a time. Meanwhile, decades of diet advice collide. Butter is back, seed oils are out, coconut is a miracle until it isn't. This feature peels back the science that marketers bury, decoding which fats fuel protection and which feed plaque. Read on if you want the simple, defensible fat playbook your heart wishes you knew yesterday. In the supermarket center aisle, two labels compete for your trust. Low fat on a pastel yogurt, keto friendly on a bag of snack crisps engineered to crackle like potato chips. A few miles away in a cardiology clinic, a nurse reads a routine lipid panel for a 52-year-old patient who swore off butter a decade ago but leans on muffins and juice to keep hunger at bay. The numbers show what the aisle won't. Total fat tells you almost nothing about what your heart faces next. The risk to your arteries hinges on the fats you choose, and just as critically, what you swap in when you remove the wrong ones. For years, public advice blurred that distinction. The 1990s low-fat wave taught consumers to fear fat broadly, and industry rushed in with cookies, yogurts, and sauces stripped of oil and padded with starch and sugar. Heart outcomes didn't improve as promised because we were slicing the problem in the wrong place. What matters isn't a crusade against fat. It's the architecture of your diet. An eating pattern rich in unsaturated oils and nuts can be relatively high in fat, yet lower your cardiovascular risk, while a low-fat diet heavy in refined carbohydrates can nudge triglycerides up, HDL down, and inflammation along. Spain's landmark trial of a Mediterranean pattern, olive oil and nuts featured prominently, cut major cardiac events far more than vague, low-fat advice ever did. Cardiologists now talk about the substitution effect. Replace saturated fat with polyunsaturated fats from fish, walnuts, and certain plant oils, and LDL cholesterol, the delivery trucks that deposit cholesterol into artery walls, tends to fall. Replace those same calories with white bread, sweetened drinks, or ultra-processed snacks, and you may trade one problem for another, raising blood sugar swings and small, dense LDL particles while doing little to help the heart. Trans fats, largely engineered for shelf stability, were worst of all, pushing LDL up and HDL down in tandem, which is one reason regulators moved to ban them. Their removal is estimated to prevent thousands of heart attacks every year. This is why two people can both cut fat and walk away with opposing risk trajectories. The office worker who swaps a lunchtime burger for a chickpea salad drizzled with extra virgin olive oil is making a different biochemical bargain than the person who replaces it with a fat-free pretzel pack and a soda. One pattern adjusts the lipoproteins and inflammatory pathways that drive plaque formation in a protective direction. The other simply swaps texture and taste while leaving the heart with the same or sometimes greater workload. None of this exempts calories from the conversation. Fat is energy dense, and portions can quietly creep. But even here, quality steers outcomes. Diets that emphasize unsaturated fats from foods like olive oil, fish, and nuts often prove more satisfying, making it easier to avoid the blood sugar roller coaster that stokes hunger and poor choices. It's no coincidence that populations eating traditional, higher-fat Mediterranean meals have historically logged lower rates of heart disease despite liberal pours of oil at dinner. Policies are catching up to the science. The trans fat-free label claimed that once masked up to half a gram per serving per loopholes has been overtaken in many countries by outright bans on partially hydrogenated oils. But old habits and old products linger, and the marketing grammar, low-fat, high-fat, clean, plant-based, still distracts from the central question: which fats, in which foods, in place of what? Cutting through the noise means focusing less on total fat and more on the fat you choose to invite into your routine. To do that smartly, you need to understand what fat actually does inside your body and why the heart is so sensitive to its chemistry. That starts with function. The roles fats play in fueling metabolism, building cell membranes, transporting vitamins, and cushioning vital organs. Step back from the marketing claims and look at the machinery. In a physiology lab at a university hospital, a technician threads a catheter-thin probe across a slice of beating rat heart, measuring its oxygen use as different fuels drip in. Switch on a solution rich in fatty acids and the readout steadies. The heart hums along. That is not a trick of the species. In resting adults, roughly 2/3 of the human heart's energy comes from burning fatty acids in its mitochondria, with glucose, lactate, and, under certain conditions, ketones filling in the rest. The heart is a flexible omnivore, but it has a clear preference. When fats are available in the right form and amount, they power the muscle that powers you. How fats get there is as important as the fuel itself. After a meal, dietary fat is packaged in the small intestine into chylomicrons, large, buoyant particles that ferry triglycerides through the bloodstream. In the narrow capillaries of muscle, an enzyme called lipoprotein lipase sits like a toll booth, clipping off fatty acids so the heart can pull them inside and burn them. Between meals, the liver dispatches similar cargo in very low-density lipoproteins, VLDL. This constant shuttle isn't simply about calories, it is about supply chains. Disrupt those chains with the wrong mix of fats or with chronic inflammation, and the particles that should be delivering energy start lingering and transforming into the LDL that deposits cholesterol in artery walls. Fat also builds structure. Every cell membrane in your body is a living border of lipids, a double layer in which different fat molecules determine how fluid, flexible, and responsive that border will be. In heart muscle, that fluidity is not an abstract property. It shapes the behavior of ion channels that govern each heartbeat. Phospholipids rich in polyunsaturated fatty acids, especially omega-3s such as DHA, make membranes more supple and may reduce the likelihood of electrical misfires, a finding that helps explain why fish-heavy diets are linked to fewer fatal arrhythmias. Saturated fats, being straighter and more tightly packed, tend to stiffen membranes when they predominate. Cholesterol nestles among these fats to fine-tune permeability. The membrane is not a wall, it's a crowd, and who shows up affects how well the crowd behaves. Then there are the vitamins that ride shotgun with dietary fat. Vitamins A, D, E, and K are fat-soluble, and they rely on bile acids made from cholesterol in the liver to form tiny micelles that slip across the intestinal lining. In clinics that treat patients with gallbladder disease or extreme fat restriction, dietitians regularly encounter the fallout: poor vitamin D status that complicates blood pressure regulation and bone health, or low vitamin K that interferes with proper clotting. Supplements alone don't fully solve the problem if there isn't enough dietary fat to absorb them. Another reminder that fat-free can be functionally nutrient poor. Protection is part of fat's job description too. Adipose tissue cushions organs from daily impacts. Even the heart is wrapped in a thin layer of epicardial fat that, in healthy amounts, acts like a local fuel depot and signaler. But fat is not inert packing material. It's an endocrine organ, secreting hormones like adiponectin that improve insulin sensitivity and support vascular health, and, when enlarged or inflamed, as in visceral obesity, sending out pro-inflammatory signals that can stiffen arteries and disturb the heart's metabolism. The same molecule can be ally or adversary depending on its context and composition. This is where quality begins to intersect with function. Different fats don't just carry different calories. They dock differently in membranes. They are metabolized at different speeds, and they steer hormone and inflammatory signals in different directions. In athletes studied after endurance events, the heart's ability to switch among fuels is a marker of resilience. In people with diabetes, an excess of circulating saturated fats can overload the heart's mitochondria, a phenomenon called lipotoxicity. The type of fat you eat nudges that balance. Even taste and satiety have a biochemical footprint. Meals anchored by unsaturated fats, from olive oil to walnuts, tend to stimulate satiety hormones more effectively, helping stabilize appetite and curb the glycemic spikes that reverberate through the cardiovascular system. By contrast, ultra-processed foods engineered with emulsifiers and cheap fats can be absorbed rapidly and alter gut signals in ways that leave you paradoxically hungry. Over months and years, those patterns shape weight, blood pressure, and lipid profiles as surely as any prescription. If you frame fat solely as a number on a nutrition label, you miss the heart's dependence on it as fuel, building material, vitamin carrier, and shock absorber. But the chemistry turns on categories, not slogans. Some fats supply those functions without collateral damage. Others exact a toll by raising LDL and stoking inflammation. To get specific, we need to examine the fats most likely to tip that balance the wrong way, starting with saturated fats and their well-documented effect on LDL cholesterol. If the heart runs on fat, the next question is which fats tilt its odds? Saturated fats are the workhorses of solidity. Straight-chain molecules with no double bonds, they pack tightly, which is why butter, marbled steak, coconut oil, and blocks of cheese hold their shape on the counter. That compact chemistry matters beyond the kitchen. In the liver, diets high in saturated fat downshift LDL receptor activity, the mechanism your body uses to clear LDL particles from circulation. Fewer receptors means more LDL left cruising the bloodstream, where it can seep into artery walls and feed plaque. Clinicians see the pattern in numbers, not theories. In a Boston lipid clinic, a 44-year-old software engineer arrives with an LDL of 168 mg/dl after a year of whole foods that included daily butter coffee and generous ladles of coconut oil. He is puzzled. He's slimmer and feels energetic. A dietitian walks him through the evidence. Saturated fats do often lift HDL, the so-called good cholesterol, but they raise LDL more, worsening the ratio that best predicts risk. When researchers replace even a small slice of calories from saturated fat with polyunsaturated fats, LDL reliably falls. Across pooled trials and long-term cohort studies, larger swaps track with fewer heart attacks. The lesson is not that butter is poison, but that the routine pattern counts. Not all saturated fats behave identically. Measurements in metabolic wards show that myristic 14.0 and palmitic 16.0 acids, common in dairy fat, red meat, and palm oil, push LDL up the most, while stearic acid 18-0, abundant in cocoa and beef fat, is converted in the liver to oleic acid and has a more neutral effect. The dairy matrix adds another wrinkle. Cheese doesn't raise LDL as sharply as an equal load of butter, likely because calcium and protein in the cheese change how fat is handled in the gut. Fermented yogurt, particularly with little added sugar, often has a modest or neutral effect on lipids. These nuances don't overturn the central point. They remind us the source food matters as much as the macronutrient label. Tropical oils deserve a sober look. Coconut oil's health halo rests on tradition and taste, but lauric acid, 12-Poirot, makes up nearly half its fat and pushes LDL higher than olive oil and canola in head-to-head trials, even if not as dramatically as butter. Palm oil, rich in palmitic acid, behaves more like animal fat than marketing implies. In countries where these oils have surged into packaged foods, population LDL trends have drifted upward unless tempered by shifts toward unsaturated oils. Genetics can magnify the effect. People with familial hypercholesterolemia or certain ApoE variants are hyper-responders, seeing LDL soar with high saturated fat intakes. For them, moderation is not optional. Others may notice only modest changes, but population guidance is built for the middle of the curve, and major cardiology societies converge on similar targets. Keep saturated fat under about 10% of daily calories, and closer to 5 to 6% for those with elevated LDL or existing heart disease. The crucial clause follows: replace those calories wisely. In practice, that means swaps, not scolds. A home cook in Houston who trades a morning pat of butter for a tablespoon of extra virgin olive oil on toast, who chooses leaner cuts and trims visible fat, who sautés in canola instead of ghee on most weeknights and saves the butter for a weekend bake, is nudging LDL in the right direction without declaring any food off limits. Over months, labs reflect the chemistry. Fewer LDL particles, lower ApoB, a ratio that looks kinder to arteries. What fails is the sleight of hand that substitutes low-fat muffins and sweetened yogurts for the same saturated calories. Refined starches won't rescue a lipid profile. It's tempting to read every exception as permission, but the weight of controlled trials still points one way. Keeping saturated fat in check lowers LDL, and when the replacements are rich in unsaturated fats, lowers events. It's a pragmatic standard, not a purity test, and it leaves room for culture and pleasure. The next step is understanding the fats that fill the gap. Oils and foods whose chemistry tends to improve cholesterol balance and quiet vascular inflammation. That takes us to the unsaturated side of the story, where olive oil, avocados, nuts, and oily fish earn their reputation. On a weekday afternoon in Seville, an olive mill smells like green tomatoes and cut grass. A producer tips a bottle and a ribbon of emerald oil pools in a tasting glass, peppery on the back of the throat, a sign of polyphenols. Half a continent away, in a Minneapolis clinic, a cardiologist pulls up a study graphic for a patient who grew up fearing fat. Both scenes converge on the same point. When most of your fats are unsaturated, your arteries tend to get quieter. Chemistry explains part of the story. Unsaturated fats have one or more double bonds that bend their chains, keeping them from stacking tightly. In the bloodstream and in the liver, that looser structure changes how lipoproteins are made and cleared. Replace calories from saturated fat with unsaturated fats, and the liver steps up LDL receptor activity, pulling more LDL particles out of circulation. At the same time, the particles that remain are less cholesterol-rich. Meta-analyses of controlled feeding trials find that swapping just 5% of energy from saturated fat to polyunsaturated fat can lower LDL by roughly 10%. a shift large enough to move risk curves. Monounsaturated fats, abundant in extra virgin olive oil, avocados, and many nuts, also tend to improve insulin sensitivity and may modestly raise HDL, an added nudge in the right direction. Outcomes match the biochemistry. Spain's pre-dimed study, which assigned nearly 7,500 older adults at high cardiovascular risk to a Mediterranean-style pattern supplemented either with extra virgin olive oil or a daily handful of nuts, cut major cardiac events by about 30% compared with a controlled diet. That wasn't a pill. It was food-based fat quality. Smaller trials echo the effect at the lab level. Walnut-rich diets lower LDL and improve endothelial function. Pistachios and almonds nudge LDL down and ease post-meal vascular stiffness. In a crossover study, adding a daily avocado in place of butter lowered LDL and the more predictive ApoB, the tally of atherogenic particles, within weeks. Polyunsaturates split into two families with distinct roles. Omega-3s, EPA and DHA from oily fish like salmon, sardines, and mackerel, and ALA from plants like flax and walnuts integrate into cell membranes in ways that dampen inflammatory signaling and make platelets less sticky. For patients with high triglycerides or recent cardiac events, prescription-strength omega-3s reduced triglycerides and, in several trials, lowered the risk of further events. Population data associate 1 to 2 fish meals per week with fewer fatal heart attacks. Omega-6 fats, centered on linoleic acid from sunflower, soy, and many seeds, have been cast, wrongly, as inflammatory villains. In controlled diets, replacing saturated fat with linoleic acid lowers LDL without raising markers of inflammation. The practical lesson is balance, not fear. Adequate omega-3 intake alongside omega-6 rich foods, with both displacing saturated fat, supports arterial health. Then there are the extras that come packaged with these fats. Extra virgin olive oil carries polyphenols like hydroxytyrosol that blunt LDL oxidation, a step in plaque formation. Nuts deliver fiber, plant sterols, magnesium, and arginine, all of which support endothelial nitric oxide production and blood pressure control. Soy in minimally processed forms, edamame, tofu, tempeh, brings isoflavones and high-quality protein that can reduce LDL modestly when they replace red meat. The artery feels these as quieter post-meal surges, steadier vessel dilation, and plaques that are less inflamed and less likely to rupture. Critics worry about cooking and oxidation, and it's a fair question. Fresh oils stored away from heat and light, used within their reasonable temperature ranges, retain their benefits. Extra virgin olive oil's smoke point is higher than many assume in a home kitchen, and its antioxidants help stabilize it in the pan. High oleic versions of sunflower and canola oils, bred for a profile closer to olive oil, hold up better for heat than older formulations. The danger zone isn't an occasional sauté. It's industrial deep fryers with repeatedly heated oils where breakdown products accumulate, another reason to favor home cooking and restaurants that refresh their oils. Step back, and the pattern is consistent. Diets that favor unsaturated fats improve cholesterol balance and dial down the inflammatory tone inside arteries. The heart doesn't demand austerity. It asks for the right chemistry. But not all engineered oils behave benignly. The shortcut industry took to make plant oils act like butter created a different kind of molecule with outsized harm, trans fats, which push LDL up, HDL down, and inflammation forward. They're the cautionary tale that follows. The promise seemed irresistible. Make liquid plant oils behave like butter, and you could have flaky pie crusts and shelf-stable cookies without the baggage of animal fat. In factories from Illinois to Indonesia, hydrogen bubbled through vats of soybean or cottonseed oil, straightening some of the kinks in their molecules. The result? Partially hydrogenated oils spread through bakeries, fast food fryers, and supermarket aisles as shortening and margarine. What chemists created in the process were trans fat isomers, a small shift in geometry with an outsized impact on arteries. Trans fats are uniquely efficient at doing the wrong things. In controlled feeding studies, they raise LDL cholesterol while simultaneously lowering HDL, a double hit few other nutrients can match. They harden LDL particles and may increase lipoprotein A, the particularly atherogenic cousin of LDL that runs in families. They alter the fatty acid makeup of cell membranes in ways that impair endothelial function, the vessel's ability to relax and maintain healthy blood flow, and they amplify inflammatory signals that simmer inside plaques. In the long-running Nurses' Health Study, each 2% of daily calories from trans fat was associated with roughly a 20 to 30% higher risk of coronary heart disease, even after accounting for other diet and lifestyle factors. That strength of association, mirrored in cohorts of men and reinforced by trial data on lipids and inflammation, is why cardiologists call trans fats non-essential and unsafe. Policy eventually followed the science. Denmark led in 2003 with a strict limit on industrial trans fats in foods. Hospitalizations and heart deaths continued to fall faster than in neighboring countries after the rule took hold. New York City's restaurant ban mid-decade provided a natural experiment. Admissions for heart attack and stroke declined more in areas covered by the restriction than in those that were not. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration later removed partially hydrogenated oils from the list of ingredients generally recognized as safe, effectively eliminating them from domestic manufacture, and the World Health Organization launched a global initiative to phase them out. Yet billions of people still live in countries without strong protections, and imported snacks or online specialty foods can reintroduce the problem. The tell remains in the fine print. Partially hydrogenated anywhere on an ingredient list is a red flag. What about the label that says 0 grams trans fat? In some jurisdictions, that can still mean up to 0.5 grams per serving, a loophole that once let manufacturers define a serving size small enough to erase the line item while leaving meaningful amounts in a few handfuls of cookies. The regulatory clampdown has narrowed that evasion, but caution is warranted with older stock and imported goods. And while deep frying can generate a little trans fat simply from heat-altered oils, the amounts are minor compared with the industrial product. The bigger danger in old fryers is the stew of oxidation byproducts that adds a different layer of vascular stress. Not all trans fats come from factories. Ruminant animals produce small amounts naturally. Butter and beef contain trace levels. At typical intakes, these appear less harmful than the industrial kind, though there's no physiological need for them, and they add to saturated fat totals. For practical purposes, the safest target for trans fat is effectively 0, because it can be. Food makers can achieve texture with fully hydrogenated oils, which are mostly stearic acid and don't form trans bonds, blended with liquid oils, or with high oleic versions of sunflower and canola that resist breakdown. Home cooks can reach for real oils and skip the shortening entirely. The takeaway lands with unusual clarity in a nutrition field full of caveats. When it comes to trans fats, elimination is prevention. If saturated fat asks for restraint and better substitutions, trans fat demands exit. With that out of the way, the conversation often turns to cholesterol, a different molecule that rides inside those lipoproteins and fuels confusion at the grocery shelf. Understanding what cholesterol is and how saturated and trans fats influence it clarifies the next set of choices. After the cautionary tale of trans fats, one more source of confusion lingers in exam rooms and grocery aisles: cholesterol. A retiree at a community health fair picks up a carton of eggs, then puts it back, remembering a headline from years ago. Down the table, a nurse educator is explaining that cholesterol isn't a fat at all, but a sterol, a waxy compound your body manufactures because it needs it. Every cell membrane uses cholesterol as scaffolding. The adrenal glands and gonads use it to make steroid hormones. Skin cells convert it to vitamin D. The liver turns it into bile acids to emulsify dietary fat. None of that requires you to eat cholesterol. Your liver and other tissues make it continuously. That internal factory is responsive but not foolproof. When dietary cholesterol goes up, the body tries to compensate by making less and absorbing a little less through an intestinal gatekeeper protein called NPC1L1, the same door a drug like ezetimibe effectively blocks. But the compensation is partial and varies widely. Some people, so-called hyper-responders, see their LDL cholesterol and the number of LDL particles climb noticeably with high cholesterol foods. Others barely budge. On average, your body synthesizes far more cholesterol each day than most people eat, which is why major guidelines no longer set a hard numeric cap for dietary cholesterol. Even so, those same guidelines stop short of a green light. Keep intake as low as possible within a healthy eating pattern, because more potent levers, saturated and trans fats, determine where your blood LDL ends up. Cholesterol in the blood doesn't float free. It travels packaged in lipoproteins, with LDL carrying most of the cholesterol that ends up in artery walls. The risk signal tracks best with how many of these ApoB-containing particles are circulating, not just how much cholesterol each particle carries. Saturated and trans fats influence that traffic in ways dietary cholesterol usually doesn't. They nudge the liver to make more VLDL and, crucially, to display fewer LDL receptors, the molecular grabbers that clear LDL from the bloodstream. Fewer receptors mean more LDL particles left to infiltrate an artery's inner lining, where they can be retained, modified, and spark inflammation. Reverse those inputs. Replace a portion of saturated fat with unsaturated oils and whole foods, and the receptors are upregulated. Clearance improves, and ApoB falls. This is why two breakfasts with the same cholesterol content can send different messages to your arteries. An omelet cooked in butter with bacon on the side delivers cholesterol alongside a heavy, saturated fat load that suppresses LDL clearance. Swap the butter for extra virgin olive oil and the bacon for sautéed vegetables, and the overall effect on LDL and inflammation shifts in a friendlier direction. Trials that add eggs to diets low in saturated fat often show neutral changes or small rises in LDL that are offset by declines in ApoB when unsaturated fats dominate. In contrast, eggs layered onto a Western diet rich in saturated fat can push LDL higher, especially in people with diabetes or genetic predispositions. Shrimp offers another lesson. High in cholesterol, low in saturated fat. It has a milder impact on LDL than its reputation suggests when eaten within a diet that favors unsaturated oils. Clinicians trying to bring numbers down lean on the same biology. Statins curb the body's cholesterol synthesis, which prompts the liver to put out more LDL receptors. Soluble fiber from oats, beans, and psyllium binds bile acids in the gut, forcing the liver to divert cholesterol to make more bile and upregulate receptor activity. Plant sterols and stenols compete with cholesterol for absorption, trimming the flow that reaches the liver. These tactics work because they intersect the pathways that saturated and trans fats disrupt. Raising HDL for its own sake has not panned out in trials. The targets that matter are LDL, non-HDL, and increasingly ApoB. The practical takeaway is less dramatic than the advertising wars imply. Cholesterol is essential, but your body supplies it. The cholesterol you eat still counts, especially if you're a hyper-responder or have diabetes, yet it is the company it keeps. The saturated and trans fats alongside it that most strongly steers LDL in the wrong direction. Shift the balance toward unsaturated fats and fiber-rich foods and the physiology tilts back. The question then becomes tactical rather than theoretical. Which everyday foods and cooking fats reliably deliver that better chemistry? The next section sketches a roster: olive oil, oily fish, nuts, avocados, and minimally processed soy that makes those choices straightforward. On a rainy weekday in Boston, a cardiology dietitian tips a bottle of extra virgin olive oil into a skillet, the air filling with a green peppery scent. "This is what people misunderstand," she says, sliding in tomatoes and chickpeas. "It's not fat or no fat. It's which fats carry the rest of the meal." Her patients don't need a Mediterranean passport to borrow the pattern that has repeatedly delivered quieter arteries in trials. Anchor the plate with plants, use unsaturated oils as the default, and let fish, nuts, seeds, avocados, and minimally processed soy do the heavy lifting. Olive oil is the spine of that approach. Extra virgin, mechanically pressed, not chemically refined, brings more than mono-unsaturated fat. It carries polyphenols that seem to stabilize LDL and support the lining of blood vessels. In the PRE-DIME trial, people at high cardiovascular risk who were assigned to a Mediterranean-style pattern and given extra virgin olive oil cut major cardiac events by roughly a third compared with a low-fat control diet. Smaller mechanistic studies show why meals cooked with extra virgin olive oil dampen postprandial oxidative stress and improve endothelial function. In kitchens, it's more practical than rumor suggests. Its antioxidants help it withstand normal stovetop heat, and a tablespoon at breakfast in place of butter is a small, repeatable swap that adds up. At the fish counter, the choices that matter most are oily and often inexpensive. Salmon, sardines, mackerel, anchovies. Their omega-3 fats, EPA and DHA, nestle into cell membranes where they make platelets less prone to clump and help blunt inflammatory signals inside plaques. Population studies repeatedly link 1 to 2 fish meals per week with lower risk of fatal heart attacks. In patients with high triglycerides or recent events, prescription-strength omega-3 formulations reduce risk further. For budget and convenience, canned sardines or mackerel packed in olive oil or water deliver the same core chemistry without a restaurant tab. A few feet down the aisle, bins of nuts and seeds look like snacks but behave like tools. Almonds, walnuts, pistachios, and peanuts, unsalted and uncandied, bring unsaturated fats, fiber, and plant sterols that can lower LDL modestly and improve the function of blood vessels after meals. A daily handful is the dose used in trials. Seeds earn their place for similar reasons. Ground flaxseed and chia contribute alpha-linolenic acid, a plant omega-3, and soluble fiber. Pumpkin and sesame seeds add magnesium and arginine, raw material for nitric oxide, the molecule that helps arteries relax. These aren't magic sprinkles. They are a way to shift the fat profile of the day without fanfare. Avocados occupy a middle role that's more than trend. In randomized crossover studies, replacing butter or cheese with a daily avocado lowered LDL and ApoB, the count of artery-harming particles, within weeks. The effect wasn't mystical. It reflected a swap from saturated to monounsaturated fats alongside more fiber and potassium. Sliced on whole grain toast, diced into bean salads, or mashed with lemon and herbs, they offer satiety that keeps the next meal from becoming a raid. Soy, handled simply, rounds out the roster. Edamame, tofu, and tempeh deliver high-quality protein and isoflavones with little saturated fat. Meta-analyses suggest that about 25 grams of soy protein per day, roughly a serving or two, can reduce LDL by a few percentage points when it replaces red meat. The caveat is processing. Breaded nuggets and soy oil-fried patties import the very fats you're trying to displace. In home kitchens, tofu takes on the flavor of the pan. In stir-fries cooked with olive or canola oil and a pile of vegetables, it is a clean swap that doesn't announce itself as a compromise. None of this works in isolation. The Mediterranean template that underpins these choices is more than an oil poured over anything. It's a plant-forward pattern anchored by vegetables, legumes, whole grains, herbs, and modest portions of dairy, with meat as an accent rather than a centerpiece. It is flexible enough to fit a Bronx bodega, a Midwestern supermarket, or a coastal fish market, and forgiving enough to make space for the foods that matter to a family's culture. What changes is the default setting. The oil in the pan, the protein on a Tuesday night, the snack within reach. If the chemistry has seemed abstract, this is where it becomes practical. Stocking a pantry and planning a week of meals around these fats is less about willpower than about making the better choice the easy choice. The closing step is tactical: how to shop, cook, and order in ways that put this roster on autopilot without inflating the budget or sacrificing flavor.